Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan and welcome to another CBT Nuggets skill. In this skill, we are going to be exploring some of the lesser known options that are available in the Kubectl command line utility. Now, as you may know, Kubectl is a ubiquitous tool. It's very flexible in how it can work. It does lots of different things, including creating resources in a Kubernetes cluster, deleting resources in a Kubernetes cluster. You can manipulate your context files that allow you to change your kubeconfig files that are basically allowing you to connect to different clusters. Maybe you're running some clusters in the cloud, maybe you're running some clusters locally, and so those config files allow you to connect to different types of clusters using different sets of credentials. So those are things you can do. You can also explore the different API resources that are available on the server, as well as API versions. Those are your basically API groups that allow you to define different types of resources within a cluster. So you can get metadata kind of about the cluster and what resources you're able to provision based off of things like custom resource definitions that third-party utilities might add into your cluster. There's also some advanced features like Kustomize here. So this is a templating tool that actually used to be separate from Kubectl itself. It was actually its own utility. But now this customized templating utility is actually built directly into Kubectl as a subcontext. So you can call Kubectl with the customize utility, and it is going to process your manifest files as if you are running the customize utility. This gives you some powerful capabilities like deploying entire folders of resources. It allows you to separate out your resources into separate files so that you're not generating a really massive manifest file with all of your resource definitions in a single file. That just makes things a little bit more maintainable. And you can also apply things like variables into these customization configs as well. So if you have separate environments like a dev environment or in a production environment, you can set up different variables or what are known as patches in order to kind of overlay those patches on top of your core configuration so that you can have different configurations depending on what your specific needs are. Maybe in a dev environment, you only need maybe 2 pods running in a particular deployment, but you'd like to have maybe 10 replicas in a production environment. And those are the types of things that you can customize using these customizations with the kubectl customize subcommand. Now, the documentation for Kustomize is still separate, so they have some information on their website about how to use this utility. There's also some other interesting capabilities in Kubectl that you might not be familiar with as well. And one of those is the port forwarding capability. This allows you to actually kind of reach into the cluster network, the cluster CIDR block that is created when you originally initialize your cluster. If you're using kubeadm or if you're using a cloud managed version that's kind of managed for you. But you can actually reach into that cluster network and actually access services that are inside of that cluster network, even from your local machine. So as long as you're able to authenticate to the API server with your kubeconfig file, you can use this port forwarding capability to forward into a pod so that you're able to access the service that's running inside of the cluster. So that's a really cool capability because it allows you to test out applications that are actually running on a Kubernetes cluster without having to necessarily expose them through a load balancer. Or if you are exposing a service through a node port on a cloud-based network that your local machine isn't connected to, then you can kind of reach into that cluster and still access the pods that are running on that remote cluster through the API server. So that's a really nice capability. You've also got this exec capability, and this is really nice because you can actually reach into an existing pod. So let's say you deploy out a pod running some web application, and that web application starts to exhibit very odd behaviors. You can actually debug that pod by executing a command inside of that pod's context, like a shell, for example, would be a really popular use case, because once you've got an interactive shell on that remote pod, you can start to run different commands to explore the pod's file system, for example, and see what maybe logs are being emitted onto the pod's file system from your web server. Or maybe you'd like to run different commands to try to debug the web server process itself. By using this exec capability, you can actually reach into that pod, run some debugging commands, and that really helps you to figure out exactly what's happening on that remote cluster, even in a production application where maybe it's harder to, figure out what's going on. You don't want to risk, application downtime, so you can leave that application running, but use the exec command to get to spawn a remote shell onto that system. Something else that's also a little bit lesser known in Kubectl that you might easily skip over is, let's say that you are using Kubectl get in order to return some objects like, or I should say resources in the Kubernetes context, but let's say you're getting pods or services or deployment controllers and things like that. Well, you can actually get back a lot more information than simply what's presented right here at the default display mode. So if I do Kubectl get and then look at the help, you can actually see that there's a ton of different options that allow me to manipulate the output of the resources that are spit back here. So if you take a look at the options here, there are a lot of different options. For example, you can do this all namespaces option, so you can actually get pods or services or any type of resource that you'd like to across all namespaces. So rather than just doing Kubectl get pods from a specific namespace using the -- namespace option, I can specify all namespaces and retrieve those resources from all of the namespaces without having to run individual commands against each of the namespaces that are inside of my Kubernetes cluster. So that's a real nice time saver, because I don't have to go, write it like a for each loop or something and, start out by listing all the namespaces and then iterating over each of those namespaces and then pass the namespace into a different Kubectl command. I can just do that with a single command, just using Kubectl's native functionality. You also have the ability to do things like selectors. So there's a selector option here, and this allows you to perform a query against resources, again, like pods, for example, using a label query. So labels are just kind of a generic concept in Kubernetes that you can apply to different types of resources. And oftentimes you will apply labels to things like pods or services or deployment controllers and replica sets, so that you can kind of identify what the purpose of each of those is. Or maybe you have just a standard label in your organization that's like, a team identifier. So this belongs to the finance team, or this belongs to the HR team, and things like that. You can actually select resources based off of a label key value pair as well. And that's really nice because it helps you zero in on just the specific resources that you are interested in anytime that you're maybe debugging an application or doing some investigative research into your cluster to figure out, who owns these different types of resources and things like that. So really handy to be able to select those. You also have the ability to do sorting. So you can actually sort the results that you're getting from Kubectl. And that's kind of a convenience utility. It's something that you could also do with your shell's native capabilities, but Kubectl itself has that functionality built in so that you can sort based off of certain fields. So for example, if you wanted to sort based off of the name field, you could use this specifier right here. It's kind of a JSON path specifier where we can say, all right, I want to look at the object's metadata, and then within the metadata, I want to look at the name property, and that's what I want to sort my results based off of. Of course, you could do that off of other fields as well. You've got the kind field that allows you to identify what type of resource it is. You've got, of course, child resources or child properties within each resource that allows you to identify certain things. Like within a Kubernetes pod, for example, you've got the spec, and then within the spec, you've got things like containers, for example, and volume mounts and things like that. So you can choose which property exactly you want to sort by. There's also another powerful capability called the output template. And so using the output templates, I'm looking for the output option right here. So using the output, actually that's output watch events. What I'm looking for right here is output. And output allows you to choose from a bunch of different types of output formats here. So you can actually spit out just the raw JSON or raw YAML representation of resources. And that can be really helpful if you are integrating Kubectl with other applications. So maybe you're writing a Python application that's consuming data from Kubectl. So you could actually have Kubectl output just raw JSON and YAML, and then have a Python script or a PowerShell script take that data as input and then parse that JSON and parse that YAML and figure out what data you want to extract and utilize out of those raw objects. So those are some really nice options, but you've also got the ability to do JSON path specifications here as well. And this allows you to basically specify a JSON path identifier as a template that you'd like to use to spit out the exact results that you're looking for to get out of your resources when you're retrieving them. You've also got this watching capability. So you've got this option to output watch events. You've also got the watch option and watch only option right down here. And these basically allow you to kind of monitor a resource's changes over time. So if you are creating new pods, for example, or deleting pods, or making edits to existing pods by applying something like a label to an existing pod, then you can use this watching capability to monitor the resources in a given namespace to see what is changing on those resources. So that's a really nice capability because it allows you to kind of retrieve those events, and then you could feed those events into other applications. So maybe you can get notified if a pod is deleted, or get notified if a new pod is created within a given namespace. So that watching capability is a real convenient feature, allowing you to monitor what's going on inside of your Kubernetes cluster. So we're going to be exploring some of these different features within the remainder of this skill, so stick with me in the next videos. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.